Hello, friends. Welcome to Between Two Ferns. No, welcome to Enigma Interviews. Hey, Kim Zetter. Hey, Dan Gooden. How are you? And what we're hoping is that this interview, that these series of interviews are going to turn into a series of long-form moderated chats. I'm Sean Sposito. I am an analyst in the fraud and security practice at Javelin Strategy and Research. But before we go any further and get our speakers on stage, which I know everyone's anxious to see, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. First, we're planning to keep this talk to an hour and 15 minutes. Second, this is being live streamed, so hello to all of our friends at home. The hashtag on Twitter is Enigma, INTVW. Most importantly, throughout this talk, we're really encouraging conversation. So our team is going to be on the side, and if you're actually in the audience, use the seat cards that were on your seat to write down questions. I'll be getting them to Seth, our moderator, throughout the talk. Finally, on behalf of USENIX, I'd like to thank our sponsors Avast, New Context, The Parallax, and most importantly, my employer, Javelin Strategy and Research. And the 2018 Enigma Conference Program Chairs Brian Payne of Netflix and Franziska Rosner of the University of Washington. Did I say that right? Can you please just give them a round of applause? Make them feel really great. We've been working on this since April. It's really great. And so with that, Brian, can you come on stage and just give a few opening remarks about Enigma?
All right. So who is familiar with the Enigma conference? Lots of hands, great. So hopefully you've attended, hopefully you love it. I think Enigma is a really special conference in the security lineup. It focuses on a lot of things that give it a slightly different emphasis than other security conferences. What I've seen and what I love about it, and the reason I've been involved with it for a few years now, is their strong desire to be very inclusive. Their desire to bring together academia, government, and industry to talk about really big ideas, and their strong desire to get very good speakers as well. So anyone that's been there, the feedback that we get is that it's just really interesting talks, it's really good to listen to, and it's ideas that sort of stick in your head and will have you thinking differently about security for years to come. So I really encourage you to all check it out. And it turns out that previous Enigmas are all available online free to see for free. USENIX is very good about their open access policy. You can go on YouTube, you can see all the talks, and I encourage you to do so. And if you want to be involved in Enigma this year, it turns out the call for participation closes in about 4 hours. So you've got a little bit of time to submit something this evening after you get so inspired here tonight. So tonight we're here for Enigma Interviews. Hopefully this is the first in a series of interviews, but to make that happen, what we would really love is to get your feedback, your thoughts on how this worked out, how we can make it better. And the idea here is that we can have some of the Enigma spirit, not just in January, but all around the year, right? And bring really great dialogue and really great conversations to everyone. So without any further ado, I will turn it back over to Sean and we'll take it away.
This is a really great double mic scenario. I feel really strong about it. So to that end, we're talking about high-risk users tonight because as people organize digitally, the physical boundaries that we're used to no longer exist, and the only keys and locks that exist are the ones that security leaders place there for us. Right? Today, town hall meetings are held on Twitter, and conversations on WhatsApp, Snapchat, and Instagram leave records that can expose their participants to a series of real-world risks. So here to discuss the contemporary responsibilities of security leaders and more, it's my incredible honor to welcome Seth Rosenblatt, the editor of The Parallax. Please clap for him. This is the only time you can clap for him. Seth has been working in online journalism since 1999 and began covering security and privacy for CNET in 2007. Alex Stamos, who's the chief security officer of Facebook. Is there an Alex? Alex. In addition to Facebook, Alex has held security leadership roles at Yahoo, ISEC Partners, and Artemis. He's delivered numerous keynote addresses, including recently at Black Hat, and co-organized the security conference trusting. Did this turn off? No, it didn't turn off. No. And then. Oh. God, just God, you're killing me. All right, I'm sweating. And finally, Eva Galprin. Come up, Eva, please. She's the director of cybersecurity for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And Eva spent the early 2000s working in security and tech prior to joining the digital rights nonprofit 10 years ago. So with that, I'll leave you alone. You won't see me for the rest of the time. Thank you guys so much for being here. Really, thanks so much. Bye.
Everyone?
The time has come.
All right. So, we all good? Mics are off? Mics are off. Okay. So I want to thank everyone again for coming to listen to Security Between Two Ferns.
Oh, I got the joke.
You got it.
I got it.
All right. One person got the joke, and he's up here on stage with me. That's great. Again, thank you, Eva and Alex, for joining me up here. We're going to get right into it. And the first question that I want to ask both of you is, and especially given recent news events, how does online security relate to real-world safety? Where are they intersecting now? How have they changed?
You go ahead.
Oh, all right. One of the things that I really love about doing events like this is that every once in a while I get pitched a softball, especially something relating to current events. So I don't know how many of you were following the doxing of Nazis and white nationalists going on last week, but this is actually a perfect example of a situation in which something which is happening online leads directly to effects on people's lives in the real world. Lest I pick on the Nazis, this is also something that happened to the female victims of Gamergate,
Sure.
in a noticeably less sympathetic situation. This happens to pretty much anybody who has been, a woman or person of color or person with unpopular opinions on the internet. This is something which teenagers who are starting to explore their sexuality or who are queer in places where they don't know anybody else who's queer are trying to avoid by sort of concealing their identities and playing with their identities. So it's really one of the core conceits when we talk about the internet is this notion that there's a world on the internet and then there's in real life, and that these are two separate things. And this is simply not true anymore. And in fact, I would argue that it was never true. The internet is real life, and real life is the internet. And there's really not a big difference between the two in the way that many of us frequently say.
Sure. Alex, is that something you agree with?
Yeah, totally. And I think we've got to, when we talk about security and safety, one, there's a bunch of languages in which those are the same word, right? So
sure.
It's actually an interesting tweak of English that we talk about those as being somewhat separate. We try to think of those in our company as being very tightly connected. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, the standard security stuff that happens day to day has become a safety issue, right? So the things that were innocuous and fun in the 80s and 90s now have, the games people would play, the doxing, the harassment has gone to the point where it really is a safety issue for both individuals, and the kind of use of traditional information security flaws has shifted away from a lot away from attacks against large enterprises and attacks against large, well-protected organizations towards attacks against individuals who are aligned with them, right? Which makes it a much more complicated, when you think of the Podestas and such, right? That you have individuals who are part of loose confederations who don't have people protecting their personal information, and then that becomes a national security kind of issue, as well as a personal safety issue for those people. And so you have that issue, and then obviously like the emergence of online platforms, all of the different kinds of ways that they can be abused to cause harm is pretty infinite. Like the truth is that people are very inventive in the use of new platforms to do the things that they've done in the real world for decades.
Sure.
And we have to be incredibly vigilant to keep an eye on that, and when appropriate, to react as quickly as possible.
How has that changed at Facebook? We've seen Facebook and other forms of social media used in doxing, in online harassment, in ways that have just escalated beyond, I think, what anybody expected.
Yeah. So for us, I mean, it's been more of a making sure our enforcement is good than a policy issue. I think for other platforms, if you look recently, they've had to wake up to this. From very early on, Facebook has had policies around doxing and harassment that have been tighter than other platforms. The question is like, one, there's obviously always a trade-off there between the use of those. For every well-meaning rule you create, there are people who are going to try to use it to suppress the speech of others, right? And so you have to be very careful that when you write these rules and when you enforce them at scale, you're doing so in a way that actually is improving people's safety, is not being used as a weapon to take away speech. And then the other is just how do we, for us, a big focus is how do we continue to enforce stuff as the platform grows incredibly quickly, right? We're about 2 billion monthly users now. You're not going to be able to do that all for humans, right? So like finding an appropriate mix where you use technology to find abusive, to categorize it, and then humans are trying to make the difficult calls in the end with multiple levels of decision making is one of the things we have to focus on.
Sure. I think Eva had a response.
Yeah.
So I'm going to push back a little against what Alex is saying. I think that Facebook has definitely been an early adopter of this whole notion that their abuse team needs to do something, and I think that that's very good. But the work of the abuse team is not transparent, and the work of the takedowns is not transparent. And one of the reasons for this is because Facebook is concerned that if they make these things transparent, that it will make it easier to game the system, and this is perfectly understandable. But EFF has had a project called onlinecensorship.org where we've had people report individual takedowns for a couple of years now. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the rules are not applied evenly across the board, that the rules often reflect the biases of their creators, and that they don't take into account a certain sort of cultural sensitivity. For example, if I am in the United States and somebody calls me the C word, it is tremendously insulting. And if somebody calls me that same word in, say, Britain or in any of the Commonwealth countries that actually has a fairly different meaning. So very level enforcement can still, and this is a pretty innocuous example, very level enforcement can still really run amok of cultural sensitivities and concerns.
Is that a question?
Questions.
So I totally agree, and this is something that people who call for more online censorship need to remember: is that you can't create these rules and then enforce them without false positives. And to be fair, like the team that works on this, their numbers are always in the upper 90% of getting it accurate. You never read a Medium post when we do something correctly. You read the Medium post for the 0.1% where a mistake is big enough that it becomes, and it's always framed as a big conspiracy or tech bros or something, and not the reality of when you're dealing with millions and millions of interactions that are problematic, that some of them you're going to do incorrectly. Like a great example, there's a lot of context in this, right? Like a great example that we keep on running into is you try to prevent hate speech, but then what you don't want to stop is people saying, "Look at this hate speech. I think this hate speech is bad."
Yes.
Right? And it's very difficult, especially when people are part of a long conversation, to have the context of this person is criticizing this hate speech, and this is part of them talking about the abuse they've gotten perhaps on other platforms. What our people in our system see is they're using those words in the ways that are meant to cause emotional harm, right? And so if you turn up that dial of trying to prevent hate speech, you will also turn up the dial of false positives, and you will catch people who are talking about it. Is it always going to be that way? I'm not sure. Like as systems get better, although having better computers to intermediate everybody's conversations, I'm not sure is the future that everyone wants to ask for, but it seems to be one that we're going for as people call for more and more moderation in these areas.
Are open standards a way of getting at a more fair application of those standards?
I mean, so I don't know what you mean by open standards. Our community standards are public. The thing is, like, how do you actually apply that in the real world is something that changes continuously, right? As different events happen. So, I mean, I can't speak for the company on overall transparency. I don't think are we going to end up with court systems that intermediate every single comment on every social media site? I think that's unlikely. I mean, we're not living in a, it is in our best interest to create a community people want to live in, right? And so the question is our system perfect? No. Is there reasonably a system that's better and that protects free speech better and that does a better job of working towards safety and that's more transparent, that's actually implementable in the real world? I'm not sure that exists.
I think we could definitely make some steps towards transparency, and I think that's one of the ways in which you can see the bias in the system. I think that there's no way to find the bias in the system without a certain amount of transparency over the kind of takedowns that take place. You can't even begin to have that conversation without transparency. And this is a situation in which Facebook has not been transparent. And again, I have a great deal of sympathy for this. And it's not like Google has been transparent or Twitter is being transparent about these kinds of takedowns. But I think that this is an area in which Facebook could really be a leader because you guys are so under the gun for over takedowns and hate speech and people being rude to one another. I think there's one other thing to be very careful about. My colleague Jillian York wrote an article fairly recently about the use of an algorithm that Jigsaw came up with to identify harassing speech. And one of the problems with this algorithm is that it was very good at letting speech which was harassing in tone and which was trolling, but which sounded polite off the hook. And then when they finally needled the target into lashing back and being impolite, that is the person that was banned. So leaving these things up to algorithms and, hey, can't you just come up with algorithms that will find the people who are mean and remove them from the internet? This is a very, very hard problem.
Sure. I want to move on to our next question. What should an organization do when one of its users uses that organization's platform to put another user of the platform at risk? So specifically, like when someone is undergoing harassment, doxing, threats against their life, what should organizations do? How should they protect their users?
I'd love to hear your opinion on this first.
All right. I'll jump on that grenade. The first thing that I want to say is that context is everything about what constitutes doxing and about what constitutes a credible threat. For example, researchers at Lucy Parsons Labs have done a very excellent job of tracking threats against the lives of women on the internet. And one of the things that they discovered is that when some stranger says, I'm going to come to your house and kill you, to a woman on the internet in the United States, the chances that this will actually happen, unless you are Brianna Wu, are fairly low. Whereas if a stranger tells a woman in Pakistan, I am going to come to your house and kill you, that is a credible threat much of the time. And so again, context is everything, and having one single rule across the board is particularly dangerous.
Right, so you're implying we have one single rule. I want to push back on that.
All right.
We have community standards that are enforced globally. We also have market teams with thousands of people who come from all of these different cultures and societies and that speak these languages, whose job it is to understand how to apply it in each of those situations. So it is not that a bunch of white guys in one room are making these decisions. In fact, the person in charge of all of this is a woman and is not a tech bro. She has a liberal arts degree and a law degree. And the people who figure out and enforce it are often from the market teams, right? And so they're in issues like that, and I'm glad you brought it up, like one of the issues we deal with is something like 85 to 88% of our users are outside the United States, right? And the majority of our users live in countries that are not free, right? They're not living in fully developed democracies with protection for human rights and legal systems they can rely upon. So when you talk about safety, like the options that we have in places like the US and in Western Europe are very, very different than in the developing countries where the vast majority of our of new users are coming from, right?
Are they informed by research on the subject?
Yes.
Very cool.
Right, and the way we think of the safety, so we talked a lot about doxing, but we track dozens and dozens of different kinds of harm. And the way this is thought of is basically we try to quantify as much as possible a couple of different axes. One of the axes is the how bad the harm is, right? So that can be from I'm upset to I'm so upset I can't sleep at night, to I'm afraid for my life and have to take steps like I have to move, or I'm not going to be able to be at my home, or I have to have like a big impact on my life, all the way to actually people dying, right? Or having some kind of physical harm. And then another axis is how often does this happen? What's the actual prevalence? And then something that we try to focus on that I think a lot of people don't is we think about how much are we actually responsible for this kind of harm. So there's certain kinds of things that happen in the world that happen whether or not our platform exists. And then there's certain kinds of harm that are invented because of our product, right? And so those are things that we have a much stronger responsibility to react to, because there are things that have basically been invented in the space of social media. And so it's not just like how much harm is there. There's like a bunch of different things you have to measure when you think about how you're going to allocate your resources. Sure. And when you have a certain budget of how much accurate moderation you can do, of like how are you going to focus like the best moderation technologies and people at.
Has this research been made public?
I don't think so, no.
Secret research.
Well, secret research, but I mean, it's honestly, it's easy to talk about transparency, and I understand why you want that, but it's a little lazy too, because the truth is...
But the reason there are transparency reports.
Right, and there's transparency reports, and we talk about, but like realistically, you're not going to... It's hard for me to think of, especially moderation decisions, where outside of the big picture one. So like a great example of a place where there's transparency and it didn't make the conversation a lot better is we had a situation where we took down a post by a newspaper that had that famous picture of a naked child in Vietnam, right? And got all this criticism for it. And the reason that rule exists is that we had up to that point a very clean rule, which was no naked pictures of children. Because when you start to get subtle about that, a lot of harm starts to creep into the system, right? The ways that you can cause real world harm with pictures of naked children are numerous and horrible. And so having a nice clean rule makes it easy to enforce. And that's something that we had to get more subtle on. Was our ability to prevent real world harm benefited from a huge pressure campaign in Europe from newspapers based upon what they considered a freedom of speech issue? It turned out not to be, right? Because they were not focused on the real things that were happening on the platform and how people were being harmed. They were focusing on kind of a little bit of a gotcha, right? So I'm not sure we're in a media environment, honestly, where a lot of transparency in this area is going to end up with people being better off. And I understand why the concern, but like there's also, I don't think there's a misalignment of goals here between what most people are talking about what they want and what the platforms are providing. So I'm not sure also whether or not the litigation of every single moderation decision ends up getting us into a better place. But
I think that there are plenty of cases in which the moderation decisions, especially if they involve suspending somebody's account, are actually very important to have in public. Again, as my colleague Jillian York pointed out, she's in Berlin, possibly why she is not here, that a lot of people's work life is now very closely related to their Facebook account. And so if you get locked out of your Facebook account, you cannot do your work in some cases. For example, if you lock me out of my Twitter account, if you lock me out of my Twitter account, you are doing me a favor. If you lock me out of my Facebook account, on the other hand, then I cannot post to EFF's Facebook page, which is part of my job. I cannot post to the other pages in which I do my activism. I am silenced in a variety of different ways, including all of the other services that I log into using Facebook. If I were to log into Spotify using Facebook, I would not have access to all kinds of streaming music, and I would be very sad. And so I think that because you have that much power, you have greater responsibility. And with that responsibility, sometimes you're going to have to bring out a little bit more transparency unless you want to keep us telling you that the reason you are having these uneven results is because you have an army of white tech bros making the decisions. Like, prove me wrong.
So I'm interested in what you're actually proposing. Do you think we should have a system of courts for when people's Facebook accounts get turned off that you can appeal through? And I don't have the numbers at hand, but I'm guessing the number of accounts that are turned off per day is at least in the 7, if not 8 figures, based upon the amount of spam accounts, fraud accounts that are created on a daily basis.
You do already have a system of appealing these things.
Yes.
It can be a little slow and weird, but
I mean, I don't understand. Is that like a system that should be public, that we should have like a legal process?
Much like our beloved transparency report, I think that it would be very nice if we had reports on how many takedowns there were,
okay, so
and perhaps the nature of these kinds of takedowns and lockouts.
Yeah, and so, I mean, so we're talking about different kinds of transparency.
Yes.
There's the transparency of numbers, which, I mean, I agree that I think we could talk more about numbers publicly, and that would be good. That's different than individual decisions being adjudicated in the public sphere, or perhaps through a legal system, which again would have to be within 100-something jurisdictions, right?
Yes.
Which, again, I get really nervous in the application of any of these ideas in countries where censorship is almost always in the benefit. Like, we're talking about the...
You're objecting to a bunch of stuff I'm not asking for.
But, well, and to be clear, I like reading Jillian's stuff because Jillian's actually intellectually consistent on this. The vast majority of people that complain about any moderation decision we make want more speech for themselves and their allies and less speech for the other side. That is something you should look for when you read an article about Facebook made a mistake or shouldn't have taken something down, is look to see whether this person is being consistent about, I think they should moderate less or they should moderate more, not just my side needs to win more and the other side needs to win less.
Fortunately, I'm here representing EFF.
Right, unfortunately, yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't know what the actual, I think about the numbers, that's great. On the individual decisions, I think you got to be really careful about thinking about what kind of standards you want to build that then get applied in places where the censorship requests are much less about individual safety and the other things that happen here about intellectual property and such, and much more about the suppression of individuals, right? And that's one of my biggest fears in that the discussion that's going on right now about hate speech is that the definition of hate speech in a lot of countries gets really problematic. And again, I think Jillian's actually
that is an
recognizes
area in
but
which
most
we are
people
in
don't.
violent agreement.
Yeah.
Right. I want to move now from talking about individual users and individuals who are being attacked and threatened online to larger groups. What defines a large group of users who are at risk? And at what point are they considered an at-risk group as opposed to 5 people who are suffering the same problem?
So when we often talk about 99%, 1% problems when we think about security and safety issues, right? That like we have to both build solutions that work for 99% of our users by default, assuming that they're never going to opt into anything more than whatever the defaults are, while also protecting the 1%. It's probably actually less than 1% when you think of the highest category. 1% of our users is 20 million, right? You're really probably talking about 500,000 to 1 million people are in the highest category of risk of like you are being targeted by top tier adversaries who wish to either access your information to cause harm or to cause you physical harm. I think when you start to talk about groups, you start to get into that next tier of interesting that is much more culturally contextual of people who are LGBTQ in certain countries, women in Afghanistan. There was an example of there's a number of examples of situations that are kind of emergent properties of cultures when ancient cultures run into modern technologies of how traditional forms of oppression are adapted, right? And those kinds of things are in some ways a lot harder to figure out, right? Because that's less predictable and more about you have to have people on the ground and you have to have relationships with folks in these groups or in NGOs who can then escalate to you like we're seeing this kind of situation. So like an example that we had to deal with in Afghanistan that there was a very good New York Times article about was the editing of photos to create situations, to put women in situations that were not considered acceptable by their families. And it was all very subtle, like putting a glass of wine on a table or photoshopping into a picture of like unmarried men and women together that would so subtle it kind of passes by and is not seen by people who are not deep in that culture, but actually can have huge impact on them. And that's the kind of stuff that's actually very difficult and an important reason why you have to build those relationships beforehand. So when those things happen, if you have a women's group in Afghanistan or an NGO that's working on these issues, that they know who to call so they can try to get those issues addressed quickly.
There are also groups of people who are being targeted by nation-state actors, not necessarily the Five Eyes, usually one tier lower. So if you are a pro-democracy activist in Vietnam, the Vietnamese government has gone through a great deal of trouble in order to shut down your accounts, usually by reporting them as being either in violation of the real names policy, or, as they have learned, Facebook responds really quickly by saying that they are posting child porn or that they are underage. And this is one of the attacks that I have seen on Vietnamese groups. We've also seen attacks on groups of drag queens, on the trans population in the Bay Area and elsewhere. We've seen attacks on specific journalists, especially Russian journalists and activists who do the majority of their activism on Facebook because they consider it to be a place where they are safe from the Russian government. And also Mexican journalists who are targeted both online and increasingly in the real world. Mexico is one of the most dangerous places on earth to do journalism, and they are killed at an alarming rate. These are also countries where the government controls the infrastructure. And so this gives us some problems when it comes to making two-factor authentication work. For example, if people are getting their second factor token through an SMS message, we have seen the Mexican government intercept these messages and break into people's accounts this way, which we find extremely troubling. For a very long time, my suggestion was, well, just use Google Authenticator, and if you cannot use Google Authenticator, this is a fine job for YubiKeys. But I have been told in many countries, like not just Mexico, but places like Egypt, YubiKeys are extremely expensive, difficult to get your hands on, and really outside of the price range of most of the people who are being targeted. So these are extremely tricky problems. They're the problems I found most interesting.
I think the two-factor example is fascinating because it's something that is heavily encouraged in the security community, certainly in sort of first world security communities. But when you get down, like that banner, when you get down to brass tacks in other countries where receiving a second factor of authentication is non-trivial, how do you get around that? Are there ways of getting around it that can be standardized besides mailing YubiKeys around the world?
So the two-factor is fascinating when you think about the 99%, 1%, 0.1% problem, right? For that million people that we're talking about, that's like the people we're talking about the same adversary. Government adversaries, very well-resourced private adversaries, people who have the ability to either clone your phone or to have control of the government-sponsored SMS network. But for the vast majority of people, I see two-factor as like seatbelts, right? For the vast majority of people, the problem with seatbelts are not that seatbelts don't save you in every crash, it's that people don't use them, right?
Sure.
That's what actually causes the most deaths by seatbelts, is people not using them in the first place. And so just like that the vast majority of account takeovers on the internet, nothing else is even close by a couple orders of magnitude is the reuse of passwords, right? Is that passwords are reused on multiple sites. One site gets popped, they get traded on the black market, and then those are used to take people's lives over. Sometimes, if people use the same password everywhere, all of their accounts at once, which make the kind of dependency graph of trying to recover these accounts extremely difficult to navigate, especially for people who don't do this on a regular basis. And so for those people, providing something that is at all better than passwords and is extremely easy to use is important, which is why we still offer as an option the SMS two-factor, because that is generally the lowest common denominator of what people can do.
Sure.
Right?
But what about in situations like in the US or in England where you know what kind of device people are connecting with? If you see that they're connecting over a smartphone, why not push two-factor to them and make it mandatory? If you're making it possible to get to two-factor in countries where they don't necessarily have smartphones, why not in countries that do have smartphones
do better two-factor?
Yeah.
So I mean, the problem is, one, to do real, the problem is not the authentication problem, it's the account lifecycle problem, right? What are all the ways that people lose control of their accounts and need to recover them? What are all the reasonable ways, right? And then what are all the unreasonable ways? Because when you have a couple billion users, you will have every day completely crazy stories of bad things that have happened to people, right? Sure. Your phone and your backpack is in the same backpack and it goes over Niagara Falls, and the same day, for some reason, your phone number changes, right? Or, like that's the kind of crazy stuff that you have to think about. And that's really where most of the vulnerabilities are being attacked in the system, is in account lifecycle management. It's things around password resets and such. It's less about the initial authentication moment. That gets, even if people have smartphones, like that becomes a pretty difficult issue. That's why we try to do a lot of risk-based, non-deterministic analysis of when you log in, when you come to us and try to do a password resets and such, that we look at a bunch of data points about that session and have a machine learning algorithm that's understood what your logins have looked like in the past, and then try to figure out, does this look legit or not? And if it looks not legit, then makes you jump through additional hoops. That could be a verified email or a text message. It can be things that rely upon the social graph. So something we push a lot for people is to have trusted contacts, so trusted friends of yours that, out of 3 of them, 2 of them can get together and reset your password for Facebook. Or, one of our, it's not a great experience, but it's one of the absolute backups, is giving you pictures of people that you should know and having you identify from panels of pictures.
I have so many complaints about this.
I'm sure you do, but it turns out that that's the kind of stuff you got to do if you want to. I mean, that's a tough one, right? But those also allow people to get back into their accounts. So and it's this weird trade-off. Because these accounts are important to people, you want to let them back in. You also don't want to let the bad guys in, right? And figuring out how to do that balance for the 99% is hard. The key then is to have, for the 1% or the 0.1%, the option to turn that stuff off and to have the much more secure. So, if you're at that level, the FIDO, time-based code generator, trusted contacts is not a bad option. You are in pretty good shape. You can turn off your SMS password reset. You can disassociate the SMS from it completely. But the number of people who run in that configuration is actually vanishingly small. It's much smaller than the number of people who live at that level of threat.
Eva, thoughts on two-factor for people who live in countries where they can't easily access it?
Well, for the most part, the people that I work with who are having difficulty with two-factor do not have a difficulty because they can't access two-factor. It is usually pretty easy for them to get SMS two-factor. The problem is that frequently they are in situations where SMS two-factor is not reliable because they're being spied on by their governments on their phones.
Sure.
And I usually move them towards Google Authenticator, but the best thing to do really would be to use YubiKeys. And unfortunately, these populations are frequently in places where telling somebody just go buy a YubiKey is like telling somebody just go buy an iPhone. It makes me sound like a really out-of-touch white lady asking them to do something impossible. And frequently, I will say something along the lines of, I will just mail you a YubiKey, but I cannot do this for 20 million people. I don't have enough room in my office.
Right.
And so I think we really need to start looking.
You'd make their numbers look good, though.
Oh, it'd be amazing.
Yeah.
So I think that it's time to start talking about what we can do in order to make these things cheaper and possibly scale better for that particular population, because they are extremely physically at risk.
I mean, in the end, we need cryptographically secure remote attestation from phones, like the FIDO standards, and unfortunately the use of, we're dealing with 2 things. One, Apple has resisted all attempts to get them to join the FIDO Alliance and to have the ability, they got that beautiful Touch ID sensor, they have this incredible secure enclave, and you can't use it to remotely attest. Not so secure this week. It's not that, still better than nothing, right? Still better than running Ring 0 on the ARM processor, right? But that cannot be used to establish a secure connection elsewhere, right? They're missing all the middleware parts for that. Sure. And then in Android, there are a number of Android phones that support a variety of FIDO standards, what will soon be W3C web authentication. But as people have demonstrated, there's way more Android 4.4 phones than there are Android 7 phones. And so the fragmentation of that ecosystem means that there is not a single standard that can be built into phones that you can actually reliably use.
Yeah.
And so for us, a lot of it is we try to get you to authenticate once in our app, and then we try to hold your identity securely in the app. And then if you reinstall that app on the same phone, that we have indicators that makes it a safer reinstall than if you come from a totally new phone. But then you run into these issues that people sharing phones, people who change phones all the time, people who change SIMs all the time.
Sure.
So it does. Right now, there's no easy solution.
Changing SIMs all the time is actually a really big problem for both activists who travel a lot and journalists who travel a lot. I know of at least one high-profile journalist who has been doing national security journalism for years, who turned two-factor off, traveled to an extremely high-risk country and had his account compromised while that was happening. I am not going to blame the service that he was using because he turned it off himself, but I think it does really highlight how important it is that we find some sort of solution.
Yeah. I think this is actually a really interesting line of discussion because a lot of these things that we're dealing with today come from previous decisions that I think in retrospect might look like mistakes.
Right.
And I'm curious to hear from both of you which of these mistakes from the past are we paying for now, and how do we remedy them? How do we get to a place where they are causing fewer problems than currently?
We want to just start with the unencrypted web.
Right.
Well,
I mean, adopting the 70s mainframe idea of a username and password and keeping it around all this time. Like it used to be nobody got fired for buying IBM. Now nobody gets fired for using a username and password as the default. So like we've collectively bought in to this horrible, horrible authentication.
Sure, but also, there's a reason why passwords are still used. They're effective. They're simple. They're stupid, but they work. And it's,
I wouldn't say that they work.
They don't work? I mean...
Well, so this gets into an interesting discussion about...
They get you into your account.
Right.
Well, I think for most people, that's considered working. Right?
This gets into...
You can access what you need to access.
So can a lot of other people.
Right. And this gets into like this argument about usability and security. And like a lot of people make this argument that usability and security are opposites. I would argue that security and safety are a requirement of usability, right? Like if you have a system and using it's really simple, but at the end of using it, you're totally screwed, then that wasn't usable, right? Like that was something that was easy. That's a different word than usable, right? And sure. I think passwords fall into that category of just because they're easy doesn't mean that they're usable, because even in the best case scenario, there's still an authentication regime that is not secure against top tier adversaries. Like even the most paranoid people, you will eventually fall for a phishing attack, right? Like it would be very difficult to live your entire life and never, if you only used passwords for everything and never fall for a phishing attack. And when you're going against those kind of adversaries, screwing up once is game over.
Right. But we're still using them, and all of the innovations that have been talked about over the past 10 years, including things that are generally effective, like say Apple's Touch ID and other forms of authentication that are simple for people, still don't have, I would say, mass adoption. Everybody knows how to use a username and password.
Touch ID is interesting in that it does demonstrate the tyranny of the defaults. That we don't have these numbers publicly, talk about transparency, but I am sure that Apple's internal numbers show that when they changed the default setup, that Touch ID became something that they bug you about over and over again, that those numbers exploded, right? It's also a great example of the misplaced priorities of the security industry, of what I kind of talk about Black Hat, about security nihilism, is when Touch ID came out, everybody thought it was so sexy to go print out a 3D printed thumb based upon somebody's thumbprint and lick it and fool the Touch ID, and not realizing like that's not the actual problem that people are facing. The problem people are facing is they don't want to set a PIN because it's inefficient. And so making something a little bit easier and slightly less secure against a very advanced adversary collectively massively improved the safety of people's phones.
Sure.
And for the 99%, and then if you have people who are so paranoid that they're worried about people lifting their fingerprints and creating fake thumbs, then you still do have options on an iPhone.
We actually ended up with a different set of problems when sort of Touch ID became ubiquitous for iPhones. And believe me, I do spend a lot of time yelling at Apple. It's not just Facebook.
No.
My rage is
We have an
for
Apple
everyone.
representative here. We can ask him up.
My
Tag
rage is
team.
for everyone. So one of the biggest problems that really came out of the ubiquity of Touch ID was that it created this lower standard for searches in the United States by police.
Yeah.
And the courts ruled that some jurisdictions ruled, we have an EFF lawyer in the audience who's surely wincing as I say this,
Right.
Ruled that requiring somebody to touch their thumb to their phone was not the same thing as compelling them to enter their password, and therefore had a lower standard which it had to meet before they could compel you to do it. And this was tremendously dangerous, especially at protests, as we have seen. So the big danger is not just that somebody will fake your thumb, it's that a policeman will say, go stick your thumb on your phone and show me what's inside.
As much as I disagree with the legal precedent, I also think we need to be careful not to over pivot towards, it's a lot of fun in the security industry to think of like, my adversary is NSA, right? Like I need to live my life so that of the Five Eyes can't spy on me. And the truth is that's probably not your real adversary. I think people are really bad at their threat modeling, and it's fun among privacy and security geeks to think that we're all James Bond and that we all, our biggest threats are, like if you're at a protest, yes, turning off Touch ID, yeah, that's the kind of advice you might want to give to people who are protesting.
Indeed I do.
But
I wrote a guide.
Right. But like, we got to be real careful when we talk about that stuff publicly to not give people who don't spend their entire time thinking about what their threat model are the incorrect impression about the security of these.
I'm going to be a jerk and push back a tiny bit, which is that for most of us, our threat model is not the NSA and it's not Five Eyes, and I applaud you pointing that out because in security we do spend a lot of time patting ourselves on the back talking about how cool and elite and James Bond we are.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, especially people of color in the United States, their threat model is the police. And that's not unreasonable. That's just their everyday lives. And so trying to make things easier for people with that threat model, I think, is actually really important. Later I will yell at Apple.
So, I mean, well, I'm interested, do you think Touch ID shouldn't exist then or shouldn't be a default?
I think it shouldn't be a default.
That's interesting. I totally disagree.
All right.
Well then, we've solved that problem.
Yes.
Alex, what do you think of passwordless authentication? This is a question from the audience. Things like gulp recognition, retina scan, face image mapping, risk-based authorization.
So, I mean, we do the risk-based. Like I said, every login we're looking to try to catch, every day we catch many, many people who log in with the correct username and password, but isn't the real people, right? And so I think every large provider has a responsibility to implement a risk-based authentication model where you're looking at each individual login and then not just deciding whether somebody gets in or not, but marking logins that look sketchy to then trap them later when they try to do something really dangerous, like change the reset password or change the password or change the password reset, right? So there's a lot of gradations of risk-based modeling that you can do. And I think you have to do that if you operate at any scale larger than a couple million users, realistically. All that other stuff, one, it's got to be remotable, right? So like, all that biometric stuff generally happens locally, right? Like it's not something that you can send to us securely and that we can make a determination of whether that's you or not. And so that's why you end up with standards like the FIDO standards, where the idea is that you have a local biometric authentication to the device, where the device makes a determination and then can make a assertion to us whether that determination was correct or not of who you are. And then two, like I said before, authentication's easy, account lifecycle management's hard. Account lifecycle management of my face is changed, right? Which happens to people, obviously. Or one of these biometric tokens have been stolen in a way that's now being misused. Like that becomes super hard.
Sure.
So one of the things we're working on the account lifecycle issue is one of our guys, Brad Hill, has built an open standard to try to allow services to vouch to each other that this person is who they are. And so you can try to, instead of everything being attached to your email, which means that your email gets compromised and then the attackers look back for all your sign-up emails and then they automatically go to each one of those sites, resets the password and take over all of those different sites, that you can create a more complicated kind of N of M system where you can decide, I want these 3 or 4 institutions to be able to reset my password. And perhaps if you're super paranoid, one of those institutions is somebody who's going to look at your passport at a physical branch, right? We don't have physical branches, but I could see a model in which, US Postal Service or FedEx or somebody who has 2,000 locations countrywide has the ability to say, yes, this is who you are, and then gives us a cryptographically secure indication that you want to reset your password. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting precedent that would come out of those kinds of things from a legal perspective. But like that's some of the things we're trying to work on the account lifecycle management is at least to build the infrastructure so you can start to have imaginative solutions that don't have to be centrally decided by us.
Sure. I thought it was interesting that you said that all large companies should be investing in risk-based authorization. How do you encourage the ones that haven't done that yet to do so?
It's hard because there's no good off-the-shelf solution here, right? Like this is actually a under-invested area. Things that which way too much venture capital have gone into and companies that will go completely out of business. Host-based O-Day malware detection, cloud-based host malware detection, a bunch of advanced network intrusion detection systems, a bunch of stuff to do with logging, like all this stuff, way too much VC has chased them. Sure. One thing that has not enough VC has chased is this kind of risk-based authentication. Because like for us, we've got something like 50 or 60 people that work on that. And we can afford to do that. Most companies can't afford to put a team of engineers and data scientists and machine learning experts on this kind of problem. And so I do suggest people do it. You start simple. I would like to see the emergence of third parties that can make it more of a drag and drop thing where you drop their JavaScript locally and do a callback or something to get it. And there's some of that, but most of that's based upon follows where the money is, which is ad fraud, right? So there are a number of companies that do that kind of risk-based, are you who you say you are thing, but they're mostly focused on trying to prevent ad fraud and other kinds of click fraud.
Sure. How important is it to get the Silicon Valley venture capitalists to invest in these very unsexy, but it sounds like essential security areas?
Yeah, I mean, the investment patterns of professional venture capitalists is one of the great weaknesses of the security industry, right? Like,
Sorry?
You buy your magical amulet? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I'm not going to use a steak and oil term because it's overused, right? But like, there's a real overemphasis on finding either what is the sexy problem of the day that is really technically complex and a lot of fun, and therefore is talked a lot about security at security research conferences. Solving that, which turns out to always be a feature and not an overall product, and certainly not a company. There's a lot of money gets thrown into those problems, and then a lot of money gets thrown into things that banks like. So there's this kind of hierarchy of when you start a venture-backed security product company of you sell to Goldman Sachs, all the other banks go to the FSI SAC meetings and the Goldman Sachs guys. There's actually one guy who I'm not going to call out just to save his inbox. All good salespeople know who he is. There's like one guy at Goldman Sachs that you have to convince that you have a good security product, and then maybe they'll test it and buy it. And then all the other banks are like, well, Goldman did it, so we should do it too. So they all throw in a couple $1 million. And so this is like the established way that you build a security product company is that you hit a couple, aerospace, big banks, some, maybe retail, depending on the kind of things you're shooting for, that you go for 3 or 4 big companies at the top of these pyramids, and then you expect that your solution will then trickle down into everybody else, and you'll build like an SMB business later and such. And because that's the way venture capitalists think about how the business plans are going to fund, and that's the kind of things they do when they're on the board, the things that they push people to think about, you end up with these big society-level problems not being addressed because they're not specifically the problems of the 20 companies that can make or break your startup and make or break you going from seed to Series A.
Sure.
And so it's a huge problem. I don't know what to do about it. Other than this, fortunately, venture capital is a self-correcting enterprise, and that a ton of companies are going to go out of business at 0% effective interest rates. Venture capitalists have the ability to extend the life cycle of these companies an incredibly long time, and because of and create kind of what looks like reasonable exits because of acqui-hires and because it's so hard to hire good security people right now, they're able to exit these companies and at least get their investment back and not take an immediate hit. When LP money starts drying up and they have to be actually more careful about their investments, it will self-correct, but we're looking at probably 5 or 10 years in the cycle for that.
I'd like to change directions and talk about metadata.
I went all capitalist on you, Ava, I'm sorry.
So metadata is always a fun topic, and I'm curious, given that we were talking about transparency reports and what can be shared from a company like Facebook, how much metadata is necessary in order how much metadata does a company need to collect in order to keep its users secure? Where's the threshold? What's too much metadata?
I understand your framing of this problem, but I think that it might be perhaps a little bit misleading because no company thinks of it this way. No company, especially a social media platform, thinks, what is the minimum amount of data that we could be collecting on our users? No, because data on your users is your lunch money. It is your ad money. It is your lifeblood. The question is, how do I collect more data on my users? More regular data, more metadata, get them to interact more, anything. After that, if the company is principled, the most that we can hope for is that they will do a very good job of protecting this data and metadata from hackers, from people trying to break into accounts, or from governments and lawyers showing up with subpoenas. But the goal is always to have more data. If you have a choice between more data and leaving that data on the ground, nearly every company will say, we don't even know what we're going to use this data for, but we are going to go ahead and keep it. And I think that's actually a really hard mentality to fight against. Because even if the security people say, we really don't want to have this data when the government comes calling, the growth hacking team will show up and say, oh, but we want all of this data right now because it could be very useful later, because this is how we get more users and attract more advertising. And in my experience, this is an argument that happens within many companies. And the growth hacking team usually wins because they're the people who bring the money in. And I think that's very sad. And all of my showing up in front of companies and telling them you shouldn't have the data when the government comes calling makes me feel good, but I'm not really sure how effective it is.
Sure.
Yeah, so you're oversimplifying a little bit about how these conversations happen.
30 minutes.
We have 30 minutes. Well, we got plenty of time. You gotta make sure your mic's on. Yeah, or maybe make it closer to your mouth. I don't know.
Can you hear me now? No? No? Silence? Yes?
Tap it.
We'll get you a handheld mic.
Okay.
All right. Yelling?
We can yell.
Yeah. So I just stalled my way out of responding.
Yeah, that was good.
That's good.
We're not going to let you get away with
Look,
it.
So first off, you got to think about the vast majority of data that law enforcement requests to solve crimes is, so a lot of it is metadata, and that points to the identity of people. And generally, it is stuff that a company is going to have to operate. It's also content that, in the social media case, we have people's photos because they upload their photos. And we have their writings because they write stuff. And then there are pieces of identifying information that we might have that is useful, like email addresses, IP addresses, and such, that some of them you have to have forever, and some of them you don't. And for the stuff you don't, we actually have, in some cases, really aggressive, in some cases, less aggressive rules about at least anonymizing that stuff or reducing the radius of that piece of identifying information to where it captures a larger number of people, right? Mm-hmm. Like in dropping octets of IPs and such. And most people don't realize this, but like you can actually read a lot about this if you go to the website of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, because for all of our operations in Europe, all the big tech companies, we basically have statements that we make and are audited by generally the Irish is the controlling data protection commissioner in Europe, where they have these statements. And so you can go read this humongous report that they've done on Facebook, where you can read after 30 days, this is thrown away, after 60 days, after 90 days. To talk about voracious access to data, when you got to think about what is actually financially useful information, and a lot of the metadata stuff is not financially useful, and therefore there's not a lot of fight over it. Things that demonstrate people's. Then why?
I mean, if it's not useful.
So some of the stuff is like IP addresses you get because you have a connection. And your original question is how much of the stuff do you have to keep people safe? And the answer is it matters on like what do you mean by keeping people safe. You definitely have to have a bunch of this metadata if you want to be able to do like things like risk-based authentication, right? Like we have something like 80 data points that go into whether or not this is really you logging in or not. Now, does that stuff have to be kept forever? No, and most of that stuff is not kept forever. It is anonymized or thrown away at some point. But that does mean that it does create a time horizon at which certain investigations can happen. And so if for example, you're throwing away data that pulls together multiple accounts, if you get a report of a dangerous situation happening, like somebody continuously stalking a victim, and then you have thrown away the data that ties the multiple accounts together, then you might have missed that this is a pattern of behavior and that this latest account is really a fake one, right? And so those are the hard trade-offs we have, and there are investigations that we are not able to complete because we have thrown away data as per our agreement with generally European regulators, which are then applied globally but are kind of negotiated in Europe.
Sure. Here we go. Sure.
So we can do a wholesale upgrade, I guess.
Here we go.
Old school. All right.
That's all.
Everyone can hear us now? We're good? All right.
Excellent.
So I want to flip the question, and instead of making it about how much metadata is needed to keep people safe, and I'm especially curious to hear from Eve on this, how much metadata, like what's the minimum threshold that a company should collect in order to exist? Like companies obviously need to collect some kind of metadata, otherwise we wouldn't have these services in the first place.
It depends on what company you are. If, for example, you are Open Whisper Systems and you're run by Moxie Marlinspike and your goal is to make it possible for people to have end-to-end encrypted chat on the internet, you keep an absolute minimum of metadata. You keep data about the people who have downloaded your service. You have their phone numbers, and you have, I think, the times at which they logged into Signal. And I think that's it. And this was actually tested quite recently when the government came calling and asked Open Whisper Systems for some of their logs. And they basically said, well, this is all we've got, and handed them a very, very, very thin file. So if you're those guys, you don't need a lot. But I can imagine a broad range of services for whom that is insufficient for what it is that they're trying to achieve. So I don't think it's really possible to answer that question for every company. It really depends on your use case.
Yeah, and you have to start to get more fine-grained than use the term metadata, right? So really you have interactions on somebody's site, I guess you could call metadata, like somebody liked this thing or clicked on this thing, that's the stuff that might be financially interesting for advertising-based sites, but is much less law enforcement interesting. And then you have like the things that identify who a person is in the real world, which is the metadata that's, I think, often tied to what's interesting for law enforcement. I think there is an interesting question here that we all have to ask ourselves, though, is where do we want this line to be drawn in the fight to keep end-to-end encryption legal, which is a fight that is gearing up pretty hardcore, again, in developed democracies right now, is a situation in which end-to-end encryption is legal, content is end-to-end encrypted, but if law enforcement wants to de-anonymize somebody with appropriate legal process, that's something that is possible. Is that a trade-off that we're willing to make to keep end-to-end encryption legal? Because I'm not sure a site that has 1 billion users, that's regulated in every jurisdiction on the planet, could have the same model as Signal, which is a charity that's basically paid for by big companies like us that license their end-to-end encryption algorithms, that doesn't have any ability to economically support itself, and that has a user base that's small enough that doesn't make it of interest to every jurisdiction on the planet, right? And we got to figure out like where we want to draw this line, because I think you can lower that, and then something's going to happen, and we are going to lose the court of democracy, and we're going to lose the ability to have some basic protections that we've taken for granted up to this point.
Is that a compromise you think Facebook should make?
What do you mean? I'm sorry, what compromise? I think right now, like for WhatsApp, there is very limited metadata that's available, but there is metadata that is available to law enforcement. And if we can hold that line, I think that's a lot better than obviously losing the ability to have end-to-end encrypted communications. Yeah. But it's hard to predict what the outcome space of the interactions between dozens of democracies and then dozens and dozens of authoritarian countries, and how the legal landscape changes when all the possible things that'll happen in the future is extremely hard to predict, right? So it's very difficult to think about what the game theory here is of what you offer and what is the appropriate level. I don't believe even EFF believes that we should create communication systems that are completely anonymizing and have end-to-end encryption and is completely free from, completely independent from any law enforcement requests or any ability to police them. And you see that in that you guys also want us to do things like keep women safe online. That's a hard thing to do when you have absolutely no ability to do any kind of enforcement. Like, you can build places that have absolutely no enforcement, they all become 8chan, right? Like, if you give people complete anonymity and absolutely no enforcement, unfortunately, the reality of our world is it's not just full of Egyptian democracy protesters and well-meaning woke people. It very quickly goes in a negative place, right? And so there is a balance of safety and metadata here of your ability. So like one of the things we did for Messenger for our end-to-end is we have a pretty complicated addition to the Signal protocol that allow somebody who gets an end-to-end encrypted message to report that message as being offending in some way and abusive. And that is the kind of thing you have to do if you don't want your feature to be used to abuse women in the developing world, for example, which are situations that we actually see in the real world.
All right, I'd like to make one thing clear, because I think that your characterization of EFF's position is completely wrong. EFF believes that there should be a variety of tools out there with a variety amount of data that they collect. We believe that they should all reply to valid and legal court orders for information with the information that they have. But EFF is a strong advocate of anonymous speech and of speech that other people cannot decrypt. Even if we occasionally yell at Facebook because we would like them to protect women, that doesn't mean that we don't support Tor, and that doesn't mean that we don't support Signal. And these are both tools that have neither of these features. There is a place on the internet for anonymous speech, and it is extremely important. It is one of the most important underpinnings of liberty and democracy, and I am offended by the notion that you think that we might not support that.
I did not mean to imply that. I'm just saying I don't think
We're cool.
Signal model is the kind of, I don't think the Signal model is a model that you could apply to a billion-user social network and then maintain the current laws as they are.
Well, the example you gave was 8chan, and isn't there a difference between group communication and communication between individuals?
Right, so there's group communication and individuals, and then the other thing that is not completely obvious on end-to-end messaging products is whether or not you can reach out to somebody, you can meet people without having any kind of real-world communication. So one of the benefits Signal and WhatsApp get is that because they're tied to people's phone numbers, it is less likely that you're meeting complete strangers, right? Like, you can't go into Signal and just search for Eva Galber and find you, right? You can do that in Messenger. And so that's one of the things you have to think about from an abuse perspective. The kind of abuse you see is very different. Like, if somebody gives you their phone number, the number of ways you can abuse that person actually vastly expands, depending, since we have so many things in the current technology world that is tied to phone number, which is ridiculous in some ways, but like, that's just the reality. And so you have to think about what kind of data you collect in those situations and what kind of abuse reporting and enforcement structure you have in a situation where you can do a search and say, I want to look for teenagers of this gender who live in this area, and then reach out and talk to them over end-to-end encryption. Like, that becomes a very different situation.
When we were in the green room earlier, we had an interesting and brief conversation about how teenagers are using tools like Instagram And they're not keeping posts around. They're not keeping emails around if they're even using email. And I thought that's a really interesting way around the issue of, is your data encrypted? Is it available publicly? They're just deleting it. It's not there. Should we be following their lead?
I mean, I think teenagers are interesting because to most teenagers, they actually have a very good knowledge of what their threat model is, and their threat model is their parents, right? And so the vast majority of these kinds of emergent behaviors by teenagers online, I think, is actually aimed at that, which is fine. I think where things start to get dangerous is when teens start to believe that there's some kind of technical backing to some of these ephemerality systems that are not actually technically backed. So we did not launch ephemerality in Facebook Messenger until it was also end-to-end encrypted. And that gives you not a hard guarantee, but it does make it it definitely makes it harder for people to write like third-party clients, for example, that can be used to collect and to beat the ephemerality, which other services that cater to teenagers and that promise ephemerality that have absolutely no technical controls have ended up with some really bad harm to the teenagers who believed in that. And so I think it's great for teenagers to have this. I think we should build features for it. I think we gotta be really careful building features that promise ephemerality that has no technical backing.
Thoughts, Eva, on what we can learn from teenagers and staying secure?
Alex Stamos is right.
Wow, can everybody write that down? That was, I'm gonna turn that into a GIF and I'm just gonna.
Yes. We could cross-stitch it on a pillow.
Aw. Just turn it, that's why they give us the mic, so we can turn this into Sunny and share. That's.
For both of you, what are your biggest, most urgent security concerns right now?
I mean, because you're the CISO of EFF as well, right? I mean, you do have like the defensive operational job. So it'd be interesting, like what is your biggest security concern?
Well, to put things in perspective, Alex Stamos is the CISO of a planet-wide organization with like 1 billion users. 2 billion users. I am sort of the equivalent of a CISO of an organization of 80 people.
But it makes it harder because it's 80 people with an extremely high threat profile. Right?
Yes. I'm actually seeing a really interesting development in the area of sort of third-tier state actors, which is to say that I sort of cut my teeth tracking nation-state actors that were not the Five Eyes or China or Russia, so not the big sexy ones that everybody is super interested in, but the stuff that nobody cared about, like Syria in 2011 when most people could not find Syria on a map, Kazakhstan, which most people still cannot find on a map, Vietnam, which didn't even have an APT number. This is the sort of stuff that I was working on for many years. And one of the things that we discovered was that these nation states were buying software made in Western countries and deploying it in order to spy on activists and journalists. One of the most interesting developments that we've seen in the last couple of years is that the lowest tier of those nation states bought that stuff and then didn't know how to use it. If you look through the hacking team emails, young man named Phineas Fisher went ahead, broke into hacking team, dumped their entire mail spool, including most of their support mails. And so you can see a bunch of support mails from governments like Azerbaijan saying, how the hell do we use these things? Only not in a language that anybody who did support a hacking team could understand, which sure made things awfully awkward. So one of the ways that we think that they've been getting around this problem is that they simply hire criminals to do their hacking for them. And the trouble with criminals, as Alex Stamos will probably agree with me here, is that criminals are difficult to predict because they take on a whole lot of different jobs, and they're extremely noisy because they do so much criminal stuff, lots of crime. And this makes them very difficult to track, really difficult to predict, and a total pain in my ass. But I think that's really where sort of third-tier nation states are going right now, and it is making my life quite unpleasant.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The nation state stuff is interesting because there's a real trickle-down effect of you have the Five Eyes, China, Russia, Israel, like the the really advanced countries will create a innovation in cyber warfare. I know that makes me, I'm wearing a sport coat, so I can use cyber.
You also have a beard.
I also have a beard, yes. I'm a bearded man with a sport coat. I can say cyber as much as I want. So like there'll be these innovations in cyber warfare that'll then, trickle down into all the other countries, right? And so, we do a lot of work in that area. We're massively expanding our team that tracks, we track dozens and dozens of threat actors. We work with EFF on that. We work with Citizen Lab and some other folks who have the ability then to reach out to victims and work with them directly. And then another area of focus there is then on, one of the innovations at the higher levels is that you don't necessarily have to hack people's accounts to mess with their democracies, right? And that's obviously been an area of focus for us, is the more subtle ways in which organized attackers can manipulate the modern media and social media together to affect their outcome, perhaps with very little or no traditional technical InfoSec issues. And so, spending a lot of time thinking about that and how we respond to that, because also, again, that is something that is trickling down. We talk about the US and Russia a lot, but the truth is that there's a bunch of places in the world where now the same kind of activity is being seen on a smaller scale, but in situations where, because these are emerging democracies, where there's often violence after elections, where causing people to not accept the outcome of an election could end up with real death toll, like it becomes incredibly critical to try to prevent the use of digital propaganda in those situations. So that's a big area of focus for like kind of the top end sexy stuff. Another area that I'm really worried about is how do we keep people safe on our platform in the real world mobile environment, right? So like I like to do this test. Okay, I want to see everybody hold up their phone. I'm going to do a survey.
Obedience to authority.
Yeah, obedience, right. Obey, I need the shirt. Okay, everybody hold up their phone. Okay, only lower your phone if your phone cost less than, say, $400 brand new retail. So keep your phone up if it's over $400. Lower your phone if your phone is not made by Apple, Samsung, LG, what are the other big, Motorola, HTC. If you lower your phone, it's made by any other manufacturer. Now it's San Francisco, so it's gonna be some hipster like Kickstarter manufacturer, so that doesn't really count. Okay, keep your phone up if it's an iPhone. Okay, look around. This is not what the world looks like, right? Like the median new user that we're at 2-point-something billion people, the median new user for us is living in a developing country, a probably not completely free country. They're using a smartphone, but as a smartphone from a hardware perspective is probably something like a 2014, 2015 top-of-the-line Android phone, probably costs less than $50 US retail. It is probably running a version of Android that's 12 months to 24 months old the day they buy it. So the day they walk out of the retail store, it is vulnerable to dozens of local and several remote exploits. And so that's like a big area of like, how do we keep those people safe? We can't, the normal InfoSec solution would be, well, okay, it's their problem, right? Like they have an untrustworthy OS, it's their problem. We can't accept that. We have to keep them as safe as possible. And so some of the things we're working on, we already kind of roll our own crypto. So all those apps on those Android phones encrypt the data before it leaves the process space. They're running their own crypto. That way we can use top-of-the-line crypto algorithms. We're rolling out things like Curve 25519 and such. And we can do things like pinning and stuff and not rely upon a possibly backdoored OpenSSL layer in the OS. And then we're looking at kind of other self-defense mechanisms that you can use to make sure that that app is, if there's malware running elsewhere, it's the DRM problem. You can't be perfectly secure, right, if somebody else controls execution, but you can at least make it harder than it is in most cases. So.
Is Facebook doing anything to ensure that these security tools and techniques make it out to other companies so that people who are using apps that are not Facebook, I know there's only a few of us left, but and
we're working on that.
Right,
yeah.
I'm sure.
I mean, so like,
WhatsApp.
Sorry?
The rest use WhatsApp.
You use WhatsApp, which is totally a different company. Yeah. I try not, like when I speak to teenagers and I tell them that Facebook owns Instagram, they are shocked. And I feel like I've lost half the crowd. Like they're deleting it immediately because so that library that we publish, we open source it. But the other stuff, there's only so much you can do on the mobile side. Like everybody's got their own super specialized frameworks. Like people unlike web apps, you generally don't start on like a generic framework with a mobile app. You start at a much lower level. So I'm not sure there's a lot we can do on that other than try to like publish what we're doing and see if people can follow. I'm not sure an open source solution is really practical based upon how we build our app, other than specific libraries like our crypto library.
Sure. Let's see here. We've got a few more user questions. Oh, here's a fun one for Eva. Does the release of NSA hacking tools really threaten individual users, or is that just noise?
Yes. Slightly longer answer. Yes, the release of NSA hacking tools does threaten individual users, not because the NSA is going to go after them using these tools, but because there is already a history of criminals picking up these tools, and in fact, other government actors picking up these tools and using them against ordinary people or possibly extraordinary people who are being targeted by governments. So yes, this is something that you should be extremely concerned about. And if you are being targeted by one of these tools, the chances are that it is not the NSA. The NSA has already tooled up with a bunch of other new exciting tools that we haven't even heard about yet.
Out of their cool code name generator. Yeah.
I think GCHQ has better code names. They're all Harry Potter themed.
Are they?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of really good ones.
And Doctor Who.
Doctor Who. Okay, yeah. Well, you gotta give it to the Brits. Are the Australian ones all beers? Is that? I'm just trying to think. Like
if only.
Yeah. I think the Shadow Brokers thing is so. I totally agree with everything Ava said. I think the Shadow Brokers release release is really interesting because it's almost a perfect laboratory experiment as to people's assumptions about the vulnerabilities equity process. And it turns out a lot of assumptions were incorrect, right? The Eternal Blue bug was patched well before the exploit was out. And there's this constant like kind of drumbeat from people who are about super quick disclosure, a constant drumbeat that like, oh, well, the moment something's patched, people will come up with great exploits immediately by reverse engineering the patch. And the truth is that Halvar Flake can do that, Tavis Ormandy can do that, but the vast majority of attackers can't. You did not see a huge amount of MS, it wouldn't be Eternal Blue, but of MS17-010, there was not a bunch of exploitation based upon reverse engineering after Microsoft released the patch. The mass exploitation did not happen until a super stable, well-tested, US taxpayer-funded exploit was available, right? And so that, like, I think really changes how we have to look at the VEP for two reasons. One, you cannot assume that the government is going to keep control of all their weapons, right? You have to assume there is a percentage that you have to build in there of a certain percentage of these weapons will be lost during their operational lifetime. And second, that the time between a bug being patched and super reliable exploit code being released is actually longer than people expected.
One quick word about the vulnerability equities process. So there was a lot of debate about the VEP, only because we only realized that it existed a couple of years ago, and it was completely mysterious, and the EFF had to sue the NSA for any information about what it was and who was involved. So one of the reasons why people frequently came to the conclusion that this was a sign that the vulnerability equities process was bullshit and did not work was because we had so little information about what it was and how it functioned. If we have any information about what it is and how it has functioned, it is largely because of the work of one tireless FOIA attorney at EFF named Andrew Crocker. And I would just like to give him a round of applause because I think he's awesome. But this latest round of vulnerabilities also taught us a lot of our assumptions were wrong. And that it's entirely possible that one of the reasons things turned out the way they were is because the vulnerability equities process worked. But if the vulnerabilities equities process works that well, I'm not really sure why the government is so reticent to tell us more about what it is and how it works.
Yeah, I would say if NHS is being taken offline, that the VEP didn't work, right? Like, and then the other, wow, I'm to your left. That's
NHS
amazing.
is British, and so if it doesn't work for them, how does this reflect on the US?
Right. Here's a question. So there's language in the NDAA to reform the VEP. Do you know if EFF has taken a position on that? Kurt, do you know? Okay. Okay.
No, we do not know if we have yet come up with a position on that, but I will be in the meeting when that happens.
We've got time for one more question. I want to ask a follow-up to the NSA and government spying question. Can you talk about any anecdotes that involve individuals being targeted over any platform?
Any anecdotes of individually targeted by NSA?
By governments, specifically by government agencies.
I mean, we have that every week, right? That we'll have. So I think people. So the anecdote, I cannot go into detail on this. There has been some reporting by Nicole Perleroff on this specific situation, right? So she wrote an interesting article about some activity out of a Middle Eastern country targeted against Americans. I think the interesting lesson for me in seeing the government hacking that actually happens is that it's much less technologically advanced than you would think. Often, especially, a lot of this hacking is military to military, right? It's against the defense industrial complex. I mean, obviously, Ava and us work together on things like democracy activists and such, but there's a whole nother class of kind of traditional military level intelligence gathering that has moved to online. And generally, most of these attacks are straight up social engineering with extremely small technical components, often against young men. It's male brain 1.0 is an unpatchable piece of software. And so, so like we've had this discussion with people in the militaries who have been targeted, of which we are neutral there, of, we don't want people to be targeted over our platform at all. It's like you have to provide, this is the kind of thing you have to provide training. And I think that's going to become more and more an issue for companies and enterprises, is this kind of activity of like widespread social engineering using honeypots, online, not in the electronic sense, but in the more traditional KGB in a hotel in Moscow sense, against a wide variety of the people in your organization, that's going to start to move up the chain, not just against like uniformed military members and the defense industrial complex, but to higher and higher targets.
Eva, does this track with what you're seeing?
Oh, absolutely. And again, I have more insight into what happens to journalists and activists than I do into people working in the military-industrial complex. But it is largely...
You don't have a Raytheon contract?
Weirdly, they don't return my calls for some reason. It's very disappointing. But I see a lot of the same stuff. I see honeypots. I see a lot of phishing. In fact, the majority of the targeting is phishing. And you would think phishing is so simple. Why do people keep doing it? And the reason is that it works. It's tremendously effective. You really don't have to get that fancy. It is rare for me to see a nation state deploy malware against activists and journalists these days. I pray for malware. I can reverse malware. But instead, what they do is they usually just send straight up phishing. And honestly, if they are... if they're determined enough and they're persistent enough, all they really need is for you to have one bad day and it works.
Which, though, we've been very negative up here. I think demonstrates how we can really make things better. If you can, right, if we can collectively, via the things that we educate with people inside the platform, we have a bunch of stuff. If you go to facebook.com/journalists, we have like a whole checklist of the things you can do to protect yourself as a journalist in country. If we worked together to raise the bar, if all these people were being hacked by ODAs and malware, that would be a huge victory, right? Because that means that the adversaries would have to be taking risks to burn their vulnerability, to burn their malware. Like there'd actually be a cost to each of these operations. And right now, these operations are pretty much cost-free. They only cost like the cost of the secret policeman who has to sit there and pretend to be a 19-year-old redhead, right? Like if we can raise the cost that they have to actually use technical means, then that would be a huge victory. And I think we can get there, right? Like we just need to make sure that those million people globally who are in that level have all gone to Touchpoint at some point, and that they have somebody they can call when they have a question. Like that's the real problem, is that there is no geek squad for I'm a journalist in Syria unless you work for CNN or New York Times or somebody who has a professional team. Or there is, it's you.
I'm not going to suggest that every single person who has a problem call me, because I enjoy sleeping. But one of the things that you might consider is Access Now has a helpline which you can call, and they will give you basic privacy and security advice. EFF has a website, an entire project that I have contributed to called Surveillance Self-Defense, and it has an entire section on what you can do if you are a journalist. And I travel all over the world doing journalist trainings. So it's not like they're completely helpless, just please don't everybody call me at once.
And we're trying to build something here for the organs of American democracy, because it's the same thing. Like if you're a campaign, you don't have an option to call anybody except the federal government, which might be controlled by your political opponents. And so, that's what we're working on with Harvard in building the Defending Digital Democracy project, of building somebody you can call if you are a candidate and you've got your 40 volunteers and a couple of well-meaning interns running your IT staff, that there's somebody that you can help both proactively and reactively.
Guys, thank you very much for coming up here and talking with us and in front of everybody for over an hour. Before we give them a round of applause, I'd like to invite Daniel Rydell, the CEO of New Context, one of our sponsors, up, and he apparently has some words for us.
First off, I think we should start off with a round of applause. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. That ending was...
I'm going to keep it brief. I'm going to keep it short. My name is Daniel Rydell. I'm the CEO of New Context. Having talks like this is, it's an honor. Our mission or our vision for our company is keeping the connected world safe. I think we learned today security is a challenge. Whatever you do on one side offsets another side. We learned about identity today. We learned about some of the challenges that we're dealing with, whether it's governments or cyber criminals or whatever's out there. These are hard problems, and I think the most important thing that we do and we like to see keep up here is debate is the most important thing we can do, because security can't go one direction or another. It has to be somewhere in the middle, and we have to keep thinking about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. My name's Casey Henderson. I'm the Executive Director of USENIX, and I'd like to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation tonight, whether you were in the audience here or at home. I'm so excited to see the growth of the Enigma Interviews as part of the Enigma Conference series, and I'd like to thank in particular Sean Sposito for coming up with the idea for this event. Sean was inspired by Enigma, as many people are here, and I hope that we will see more proposals from you in the conference submission system shortly. You have a few hours yet to submit proposals to speak. Yes, very shortly. So please join me in thanking our speakers one more time. And also thanks to our generous sponsors for getting this series started, and also to the founding sponsor of the Enigma Conference, Google, whose generous sponsorship allowed this whole thing to kick off. So thanks again for being here, and have a great evening.
That's all right. Thank you guys. The ending was spot on, a little bit of advice. Give people a way to do something.
Yeah. Everybody
Oh, yeah.